How can unimaginable horror hide in plain sight, buried beneath the daily lives of hundreds? This is the haunting question that lingers over the Sichuan Sewage Tank Murders, a case that shocked the entire nation of China. In a seemingly ordinary residential area bustling with families, children, and everyday routines, a gruesome truth lay concealed beneath their feet for years. The discovery began with an unsettling odor, one that had been dismissed countless times before as a mere nuisance. But in March 2011, this odor led to an unthinkable revelation. 3 decomposing bodies of women were found hidden in sewage tanks within the community. For years, these tanks served as a silent graveyard, with the surrounding community oblivious to the horrors buried below. The prime suspect in this chilling case was not a stranger to the area. He was someone the residents saw daily, someone they trusted to guard their homes, a 61-year-old security guard named L.A. Tianfa. This elderly man lived just steps away from where the bodies were hidden, carrying on his daily life as if nothing had happened. For years, he harbored his dark secrets, blending seamlessly into the ordinary rhythm of the community. His quiet demeanor masked the unimaginable violence he had inflicted on his victims. What drove this man to commit such heinous acts? How could a place meant to be a safe haven for families harbor such darkness? These questions would lead to a detailed investigation, uncovering the twisted psyche of a killer and the tragic stories of the women whose lives he brutally ended. This is the story of the Sichuan Sewage Tank Murders, a tale of betrayal, horror, and the long-hidden truths that came to light in the most disturbing of ways. It was a quiet March morning in 2011, the kind of morning when life in a peaceful residential area on Flower Road, Diyang, Sichuan, moved at its usual unhurried pace. This neighborhood, lined with modest apartment buildings and shaded by blooming tea trees, was home to families, retirees, and workers seeking respite from the hustle of urban life. But the calm was about to be shattered. Residents began to notice a foul, overpowering stench in the air. At first, many dismissed it as an issue with the local sewage system, a clogged drain, perhaps, or stagnant water collecting under the streets. Yet, as the hours passed, the odor became unbearable. An acrid, putrid smell that crept into homes and left people gagging. Complaints began to pour into the local maintenance office, demanding urgent attention to the problem. Technicians arrived to investigate, their tools clanging loudly as they worked to lift the heavy metal manhole cover. A small crowd of curious residents gathered, covering their noses with handkerchiefs and scarves. What lay beneath the cover, however, would not be a simple plumbing issue. Instead, it was the first glimpse into a nightmare that had remained hidden for years. As the technicians pried open the manhole cover, the stench intensified, almost knocking them back. But what made them recoil in shock wasn't the smell, it was the horrifying sight that emerged as they peered into the darkness below. Among the murky, black water of the sewage system, a decomposed human foot was clearly visible. The pale, discolored limb protruded grotesquely, tangled in sludge and refuse. The scene erupted into chaos. One technician stumbled backward, his hand covering his mouth to suppress a scream. Others quickly called for the police, their voices shaking with panic. The crowd, initially curious, began to scatter, murmurs of fear and disbelief rippling through the neighborhood. Mothers pulled their children away, while older residents crossed themselves or murmured prayers under their breath. Word of the gruesome discovery spread like wildfire, and soon the entire community was buzzing with speculation. Who could it be? How long had the body been there? Why hadn't anyone noticed earlier? These questions hung in the air like the foul smell that now seemed to taint the entire neighborhood. Within minutes, the local police arrived, sirens wailing as officers secured the area. The crowd, though reluctant to get any closer, lingered on the outskirts, watching as law enforcement set up a perimeter around the manhole. The sight of uniformed officers and forensic experts, clad in protective suits and masks, added a surreal layer to the unfolding drama. The forensic team worked carefully, lowering specialized equipment into the manhole to retrieve the remains. It took hours of painstaking effort to extract the body from the sludge, a task made all the more difficult by the advanced state of decomposition. When the first body was finally removed, the onlookers gasped. The corpse was that of a woman, her features unrecognizable, her clothes soaked and tattered, clinging to what was left of her frame. Near the body, forensic experts found a set of worn, outdated women's clothing, a floral blouse, and a skirt that hinted at a life once lived. But these clues, though significant, raised more questions than answers. Who was this woman? How had she ended up in the sewage tank? hidden beneath the very streets the residents walked every day. Police officers combed the area for additional evidence, photographing every angle of the scene and taking samples of the sewage for further analysis. They interviewed residents, searching for any information about missing persons or suspicious activity in the area. Yet, no one seemed to have any concrete answers. The first body was just the beginning of a mystery that would soon grow darker and more horrifying. The discovery of the first body shocked the peaceful residential neighborhood, but the worst was yet to come. As the police expanded their investigation, their attention turned to a second sewage tank located within the premises of the security guard's quarters. It was an unusual setup, raising immediate suspicions. What secrets could this second tank hold? The tank was sealed shut with an old, cracked concrete lid. Police noted signs of tampering. The lid appeared to have been hastily patched with cement, as though someone had tried to ensure it would remain untouched. Armed with this clue, officers decided to investigate further. The forensic team worked cautiously, donning protective gear as they removed the lid. What they uncovered sent shockwaves through the community yet again. Inside the second tank, submerged in the same foul sludge, was another human body. The state of decomposition mirrored that of the first victim, making identification nearly impossible. The clothing on this second body, though tattered and faded, suggested another female victim. As the corpse was carefully extracted, the crowd gathered outside the cordoned-off area grew silent, the horror in their faces unmistakable. The news spread quickly, filling the air with fear and whispers. The community's initial shock deepened into paranoia. Was there a serial killer living among them? How could such atrocities go unnoticed for so long? The residential area, once a picture of tranquility, was now a hub of fear and suspicion. Determined to leave no stone unturned, investigators expanded their search across the entire property. Their efforts soon led them to another harrowing discovery. Just hours after finding the second body, they uncovered a third. This time, the remains were located in a separate section of the sewage system connected to the main drainage network. The third body was curled in the same fetal position as the others, a grim and disturbing pattern. Forensic specialists noted the identical state of decay, long-term decomposition, severely damaged remains, and little to no discernible physical features. All three victims were women, their identities lost to time and neglect. The discovery of 3 bodies in less than 48 hours was almost too much for the residents to comprehend. People began questioning everything. How could this level of brutality occur in such a crowded, closely knit environment? What else had gone unnoticed? Parents started escorting their children to and from school. Neighbors eyed one another with suspicion. The community's peace was irreparably shattered. The forensic analysis was a slow and grueling process. Experts worked around the clock to piece together what little evidence remained. Preliminary examinations suggested that all 3 victims had been dead for at least 2 years. This meant their remains had been hidden in the sewage tanks long before the foul smell became noticeable. One of the biggest challenges was identifying the victims. Advanced decomposition had obliterated any chance of facial recognition, and the acidic environment of the sewage tanks had destroyed most personal belongings that could offer clues. The tattered clothing on the bodies provided no distinguishing features, no logos, no labels, no unique patterns. Forensic pathologists turned to DNA analysis, but this too was complicated by the poor preservation of the remains. The positioning of the bodies offered vital clues. All 3 victims were curled into fetal positions, which forensic specialists explained could only occur under specific circumstances. After death, a body stiffens due to rigor mortis, but later becomes flexible again. The tightly curled postures suggested the bodies had been compressed into the tanks shortly after death, pointing to deliberate concealment. Despite the daunting challenges, investigators remained determined to uncover the identities of these women. They scoured missing person reports, reaching out to families in the region for any leads. Meanwhile, the gruesome discoveries painted an increasingly clear picture. This was no random act of violence. The perpetrator had a pattern, and this was not the work of an opportunistic killer. It was systematic, premeditated, and chillingly calculated. As the investigation deepened, fear gave way to speculation within the tight-knit community. Residents, initially shaken by the grisly discoveries, began recalling past incidents and oddities they had previously dismissed. Whispers spread about women seen entering the small security guard's room late at night. While such visits had initially been shrugged off as harmless interactions, they now carried a sinister undertone. Who were those women? Could they have been the victims? The trail of suspicion soon led to a name: Alei Aitianfa, the former security guard. Though Elia had left his position at the residential area in 2008, many still remembered him. He was described as a quiet, solitary man who rarely interacted with others unless it was necessary for his duties. But those who had crossed paths with him hinted at a darker side. Some residents recalled feeling uneasy around him, citing his sharp temper and an aura of intimidation. Eli's abrupt departure in 2008 also raised eyebrows. He had vanished without warning, taking with him over 3,000 yuans collected from residents for utility payments. At the time, the theft had been written off as the desperate act of a disgruntled employee. Now, with the discovery of the bodies, his sudden disappearance seemed far more suspicious. Born in the early 1950s, Eli Tianfa had a troubled history. Police uncovered chilling details about his past, painting a portrait of a man capable of horrific violence. Before working as a security guard, Elia had been convicted of sexually assaulting a female co-worker and served a 6-year prison sentence. After his release, he struggled to reintegrate into society, taking on menial jobs that allowed him to avoid close scrutiny. In 2003, Elia was hired as a security guard at the T-Flower Road residential area. To the residents, he was just an aging man tasked with keeping the community safe. Few knew about his criminal record, as background checks were not rigorously enforced at the time. Over the next 5 years, Eli maintained a low profile, carrying out his duties with minimal complaints. But behind the quiet facade, he harbored deep-seated anger and a propensity for manipulation. Eli's personal life was equally shrouded in mystery. He had no known family or close friends, and his interactions with others were often transactional or superficial. This isolation, coupled with his violent tendencies, created the perfect storm for the crimes he would later commit. Convinced that Elia Tianfa was their prime suspect, the police launched a citywide search for him. Tracking him down, however, was no easy task. Elia had left behind no forwarding address and seemed to have disappeared without a trace. Investigators began by interviewing former colleagues and residents who might have interacted with him during his time as a security guard. A former co-worker described Elia as a man who didn't fear anything during a casual conversation over drinks. Elia had once boasted about his ability to keep calm under pressure, even jokingly claiming that he could get away with anything. At the time, his comments had been dismissed as bravado, but they now seemed like chilling foreshadowing. The breakthrough came when police uncovered records of Elia renting a small room near a bus station in the city. Surveillance footage showed an elderly man matching Eli's description frequenting the area. Armed with this lead, officers moved swiftly to apprehend him. Within 50 hours of the initial discovery of the bodies, Elia Tianfa was in custody. His arrest marked a turning point in the investigation, but it was only the beginning. The community watched anxiously as the police prepared to unravel the full extent of Eli's crimes. What had driven him to commit such heinous acts? And how had he managed to evade detection for so long? These questions loomed large as the hunt for answers finally closed in on the man who had turned their neighborhood into a secret graveyard. The search for Elia Tianfa culminated in a tense operation just 2 days after the initial body was discovered. Following a lead, police tracked him to a small, dimly lit room he had rented near the city's central bus station. It was a stark, almost transient space, furnished with only a bed, a small table, and a battered suitcase. This was the hideout where Elia had lived in self-imposed isolation since fleeing the residential area 3 years earlier. At 6:30 p.m., officers surrounded the building, ensuring that Elia had no means of escape. They moved quickly and decisively, bursting through the door with guns drawn. Elia was caught off guard, seated at the table with a half-eaten bowl of noodles in front of him. He froze at the sight of the officers, his weathered face betraying a mix of shock and resignation. There was no struggle. Elia allowed himself to be handcuffed, remaining silent as the officers read him his rights and escorted him to the patrol car. His calm demeanor unnerved the arresting officers, as if he had been waiting for this moment. The entire operation lasted less than 5 minutes, but its impact reverberated through the community, offering a glimmer of relief to residents who had been living in fear. Once in custody, Eli maintained his silence for hours during initial questioning. He sat motionless, his gaze fixed on the table in front of him. But as investigators presented the mounting evidence, the 3 bodies, the testimonies from witnesses, and his prior criminal record, Eli's composure began to crack. By the 3rd day of interrogation, he finally spoke. What followed was a chilling confession that revealed the depths of his depravity. Lai recounted his first murder with an eerie detachment. Chang Li was an 18-year-old waitress at a nearby hotpot restaurant. One evening in 2004, she had injured her hand while working and came to the security guard's room seeking first aid. Lai provided her with a bottle of alcohol to disinfect the wound, and their interaction ended without incident. However, a few days later, Shang returned to the security room, this time asking for a place to stay after leaving her job. Lai saw an opportunity. Under the guise of kindness, he allowed her to stay in his quarters temporarily. But when Zhang began requesting money to support herself, tensions escalated. According to Lai, she threatened to report him for sexual harassment if he didn't comply. In a fit of rage, he strangled her to death. Her body was the first to be concealed in the sewage tank near the security room. A year later, in 2005, Lai struck again. Tang Yan, a 16-year-old girl, had been visiting a friend in the residential area when she found herself locked out of their apartment. She approached Lai's security room to wait for her friend's return. Lai, recognizing her vulnerability, offered her tea and a place to sit. Over the next few hours, he manipulated her trust, coaxing her into lowering her guard. When Tang requested his help in finding her friend, Lai turned predatory. He claimed she became demanding and began insisting he lend her money. Fearing that she too might threaten to expose him, Lai lashed out. Using the same method as before, he strangled her and disposed of her body in the sewage tank, just meters away from Zhang's. The final victim, Xi Fang, was a 38-year-old woman and an acquaintance of Lai's. She had approached him in 2006, asking for a loan to renovate her home. Lai initially refused, but when Xi threatened to send people to deal with him, he felt cornered. In his confession, Lai described feeling a surge of uncontrollable anger. He invited Xi into his quarters under the pretense of discussing the loan, but once inside, he attacked her. Her body joined the others in the hidden graves beneath the sewage tanks. Lai believed he had perfected his method, choosing victims who were outsiders or estranged from their families, ensuring that their disappearances would not immediately raise suspicion. As Lai recounted his crimes, investigators observed patterns in his behavior that revealed his twisted motivations. He claimed that financial desperation and the fear of exposure drove him to kill, but his methods indicated a calculated approach. Lai chose his victims carefully, targeting women who were vulnerable and lacked strong social connections. Over time, Lai admitted, the weight of his crimes began to consume him. While he continued to live and work in the residential area for 2 more years, he was plagued by vivid nightmares. He described seeing the faces of his victims in his dreams, Zhang's terrified eyes, Tang's pleas for mercy, Shai's final gasps. These visions, he said, haunted him every night, forcing him to sleep with the lights on. By 2008, Lai could no longer bear the psychological toll. His paranoia grew, and he became convinced that someone would eventually uncover his crimes. This fear drove him to flee, stealing from the residents to fund his escape. But no amount of distance or time could erase the memories of what he had done. In his words, the ghosts followed me everywhere. They were always watching. The revelation of Lai Tianfei's crimes left an indelible scar on the once peaceful community of Deflower Road. For years, the residents had gone about their daily lives, unaware of the horrors buried beneath their feet. The discovery of 3 women's bodies and the subsequent arrest of the security guard they had trusted created a profound sense of betrayal. Parents who had allowed their children to play freely in the courtyards now shuddered at the thought of what had been concealed so close by. Elderly residents who had often exchanged pleasantries with Lai struggled to reconcile their memories of the soft-spoken man with the heinous acts he had committed. "We lived alongside a monster," one neighbor remarked in disbelief, echoing the sentiments of many others. The families of the victims were perhaps the most profoundly affected. For years, they had clung to the faint hope that their loved ones might still be alive, lost somewhere in the world but safe. The confirmation of their deaths brought a mixture of grief and relief: grief for the tragic loss, and relief for the closure they had desperately sought. Still, the manner of their deaths and the years their bodies had been discarded in sewage tanks deepened the family's anguish. The pain of knowing their loved ones' suffering weighed heavily on their hearts, leaving a void that no court ruling could fill. The trial of Lai Tianfa began with intense public scrutiny. Crowds gathered outside the courthouse, and media outlets followed the proceedings closely, eager to uncover every detail of the case. Lai was charged with multiple counts of murder, along with theft and concealment of corpses. The evidence against him was overwhelming. Forensic reports, witness testimonies, and most damning of all, his detailed confession. Throughout the trial, LAI maintained a stoic demeanor. Witnesses described him as unnervingly calm, his face devoid of emotion as the prosecutors recounted the gruesome details of his crimes. There were no tears, no signs of remorse, only a chilling indifference that further enraged the public. The court proceedings highlighted LAI's calculated methods and his complete disregard for human life. Prosecutors argued that his actions went beyond mere desperation or fear of exposure. They demonstrated a pattern of cruelty and manipulation. The defense attempted to argue that LAI's troubled past and psychological issues should be considered as mitigating factors, but these claims were swiftly dismissed. The court determined that the severity of his crimes warranted the harshest possible punishment. In the end, LAI Tianfa was sentenced to death. The ruling was met with widespread approval from the community and the victims' families, who saw it as a measure of justice for the lives he had stolen. Yet, even as the sentence was handed down, LAI remained impassive, his expression unchanging as he was led out of the courtroom. While the conviction and sentencing of LAI Tianfa brought a sense of closure to the case, it also raised uncomfortable questions about the societal and systemic failures that had allowed his crimes to go undetected for so long. How could 3 women disappear without anyone noticing? Why was LAI, a convicted felon, entrusted with a position of responsibility in a residential community? The case shed light on the vulnerabilities of women, particularly those from marginalized backgrounds, who often lack the resources or support to protect themselves. Zhang Li, Tang Yan, and Xai Fang were all outsiders to the community, young women navigating uncertain circumstances. Their isolation made them easy targets for a predator like LAI. Furthermore, the investigation revealed lapses in oversight and accountability. Background checks for employees in sensitive roles, like security guards, were either non-existent or poorly enforced. Residents, unaware of LAI's past convictions, unknowingly placed their trust in a man who should never have been in such a position. The tragedy also underscored the importance of vigilance within communities. Several residents admitted to noticing strange behavior around the security guards' quarters, but dismissed their instincts or feared causing trouble by reporting their suspicions. In hindsight, these missed opportunities to intervene took on a haunting significance. The aftermath of the Sichuan Sewage Tank Murders left a profound impact on all who heard of it. For the residents of Deflower Road, life would never feel the same. The physical presence of the sewage tanks served as a grim reminder of the horrors that had unfolded there, and many families chose to leave the area entirely, unable to shake the lingering sense of dread. LAI Tianfa's crimes were a stark reminder of humanity's capacity for evil, but they also highlighted the resilience of the human spirit. Despite the horrors, the victims' families found ways to honor their loved ones, ensuring that their memories would not be defined solely by the brutality of their deaths. Advocacy groups called for reforms in hiring practices and greater awareness of violence against women, hoping to prevent such tragedies from occurring again. As LAI awaited his execution, the community grappled with the lasting scars of his actions. His crimes were an affront not just to his victims, but to the very fabric of trust and safety that binds a community together. Yet, amid the darkness, there was a collective determination to rebuild, to ensure that the sins of the past would not define the future. The story of the Sichuan Sewage Tank Murders remains a chilling chapter in criminal history, a tale of unimaginable cruelty and hard-won justice. It serves as both a cautionary tale and a call to action, reminding us of the importance of vigilance, compassion, and the fight to protect the most vulnerable among us.